What happened? Just to recapitulate, I'm sure many of you know. It began with what seemed rather unsurprising, a Tuareg rebellion, another Tuareg rebellion in the very north of Mali. I believe I now have here a map of Mali. There we go. In the very north near the Algerian border, it seemed like another Mali rebellion. As a crisis deepened, this movement in Mali, which now took the name, as a reconfiguration of historical movements among the Tuareg, took the name of the National Movement for the Liberation of the Azawad. Azawad being the Tuareg term for this region, the historical homelands, right? So the MNLA in its French acronym. The MNLA quickly proved to actually have some success in taking some towns, some small outposts, etc., along this area from the Malian military. Very badly managed by the Malian military and by the Malian government, leading to protests, claims that some massacre of Malian soldiers by MNLA forces in one of these areas was hidden by the government, etc. And so quickly, this reached a crisis proportion in Bamako, in the capital city. And we had popular protests of various sorts in Bamako, beginnings of what seemed like military mutinies. There was a famous incident in which the wives of the military men marched on the presidential palace, etc. And so it was very clear that there was a lot of unrest and a lot of unhappiness. The government was not particularly effective at handling it, and events very quickly unfolded. Very complicated, but the bottom line is that protests escalated. A military mutiny of sorts led to a march on the presidential palace on the 22nd of March of this year, and in what seems almost an accidental coup. The president ran out the back door, disappeared, and a coup had happened. And Mali was, the 20-year experiment, 20-plus year experiment with democracy in Mali came to an end in this sort of abrupt and almost haphazard kind of fashion. There was, of course, an immediate political crisis. Those of us watching it, we saw that this coup, there's a lot of indication it was very poorly planned, if planned at all. It was relatively low-ranking officers. They took about 24 hours, as I recall, to say anything because they didn't have a prepared statement. When they did, there was a poorly read statement by a bunch of men crowded behind a TV screen, trying to all be on TV while this was read, etc. It was very clear that there wasn't a clear plan for what comes next. This was not the kind of coup that had plotted out what do we do the day after the coup. And so immediately this led to a huge crisis, political crisis in Bamako, in a sense of what do we do? How do we get out of it? The ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, immediately condemned the coup, as they do, and declared that they would sanction the government unless there was an immediate transition to a constitutional order, etc. The effort, in fact, what eventually happened was that the ousted president, Amadou Toumani Touré, popularly known as ATT, agreed to officially resign his position, triggering a constitutional mechanism which will allow the president of the National Assembly to then become the interim president. And so that was done. And so this was sort of a way of whitewashing to create a constitutional provision. But the political crisis continued. Among other things, that president, an interim president, was supposed to then organize elections within 45 days, according to the Constitution, an obvious impossibility in that context. As this unfolded, the MNLA, it's a crisis in Bamako, no one clearly in charge, the army disintegrates, the MNLA moved quickly and quickly started to occupy the entire north of Mali and took the crucial cities eventually of Timbuktu, Gao, Kidal. Kidal being a relatively small place. Those are really the only cities in northern Mali, and even cities is a bit of a stretch, right? They're largely urban agglomerations, I think, in many ways. And so they quickly, MNLA was in charge of the northern part of the country. They quickly declared the independence of the Republic of the Azawad, or as they insisted, the secular democratic Republic of the Azawad, insisting very much on this notion that what they wanted was this regional identity within respecting the other borders of Mali. In the past, we used to see maps of the Azawad in the 1990s rebellions that had this large amorphous zone over a number of countries, right, where the Tuareg operate. These clearly did not want to step on Algeria, Mauritania, or Nigeria's toes, and so they were limiting themselves to northern Mali, but said they wanted an independent and secular Republic of the Azawad. What happened? Again, a long and complicated story, but very quickly, the MNLA found that it was in only partial control of those urban areas, as various Islamic groups, starting with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, but then quickly, primarily in Timbuktu, joined or replaced or in alliance with a group calling itself Ansar ad-Din, which was a group with a similar ideology to Al-Qaeda, composed primarily of Tuareg, in this area, and then later another group which calls itself the Movement for Unity and Jihad in West Africa, Mujao, based primarily in Gao. These groups found themselves in larger control of these cities and pretty quickly ousted the MNLA, pushed the MNLA, the Tuareg movement, out, and it declared that they had no interest in a secular and democratic republic. They were interested in neither secularism nor democracy, and they weren't interested in independence. Their goal was much broader. It was to establish Sharia, or their particular version of Sharia and Islamic law, across the region, across all of Mali, and eventually across all of West Africa. They started, as you've all seen in the news, with some highly controversial things and some symbolic acts, destroying the saints' tombs of Timbuktu, etc., things like that, which had just recently been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But also, of course, human implications of this: floggings, amputations, a stoning of a couple for adultery, etc. A limited number, but very highly, very highly visible and very problematic, intentionally problematic moments. As this goes on, in Bamako, the political situation continued to disintegrate, right? As when you thought things had gotten to rock bottom, they got worse. In May, after this constitutional transition of sorts, and we were trying to decide what to do, in anger again at what this transitional government was doing in a very polarized setting, a mob attacked the presidential palace and beat the interim president who had taken office constitutionally so badly that he was evacuated to France and spent well over 2 months in France attempting to recuperate before he could even come back to the country. So we had the president beaten, a power vacuum. He was in France, and obviously, very clearly, no one in charge, right? Very clearly no one in charge. It was clear, and it still is clear, I think, to me, that the junta, with the Captain Sanogo, who was the one who led this original coup in March, still retained the power to checkmate. When whatever power authority was there, and governments would say, we'll do this, we'll do that, we're thinking of doing this, there would be quick backtracking should the junta express its opposition, right? And so it's very clear that they continue to hold the charges, control it in many ways.